The heat seemed to slide down the marble floors of the Grand Hall in Boston, mingling with the sound of refined laughter and carefully practiced smiles that sparkled as brightly as the old crystal chandeliers above. Everyone present felt wrapped up in the excited energy, knowing that the long-awaited wedding of Caroline and Jonathan was just hours away. The event was more than a simple wedding. It was a promise, a thread linking together generations of family legacy among the Parkers, whose traditions had shaped their public life for decades. As the air buzzed with excited whispers, Eleanor finally strode through the front entrance. She carried herself tall and confident, her straw hat perched perfectly, adding an edge of charm to her steady walk. Almost immediately, a change rippled through the crowd. Subtle cues, tightened shoulders, eyes darting to others, hinted that Eleanor's arrival was something unexpected. The Parkers, Caroline's family, always prided themselves on keeping their circle tight, and it showed. Their gazes were cool, almost chilly, in sharp contrast with the early summer heat. Even so, Eleanor's calm, gentle smile hardly faltered. She tried to ease the tension floating in the air, but the mood around her remained guarded. A few guests near the entrance shuffled uncomfortably, giving Eleanor a polite nod before moving on. She couldn't help noticing the way Mrs. Parker barely concealed her disapproval, the older woman's lips pressed tightly together as she whispered to her husband. Still, Eleanor reminded herself she had every right to be there. She glanced around, taking in the swirling gowns and polished shoes, the high ceilings echoing with high-pitched laughter. Jonathan, always warm-hearted, had insisted that Eleanor be invited, knowing how much she meant to Caroline. As Eleanor made her way deeper into the hall, the edges of anxiety softened. She smiled quietly at Caroline from across the room, catching her friend's quick wink, a silent encouragement that things would be okay. Bit by bit, Eleanor let the luxury of the evening wash over her. She listened as the string quartet played near the windows, and she even caught herself laughing at an old family friend's story about a mishap with an overzealous golden retriever and a decades-old wedding cake. Slowly, the reservation inn. The air faded, and people began to mingle a little more freely. Eleanor found herself standing beside the refreshment table, glass in hand, feeling less like an outsider and more like she truly belonged there for Caroline's big day. During the cocktail hour, it became harder and harder to ignore how the Parkers were quietly shutting Eleanor out. They smiled and welcomed anyone they considered proper company, trading empty compliments and toasting with champagne. But when Eleanor drifted their way, the conversation always seemed to shrink. People looked past her, or worse, right through her, their polite words covering how little they actually wanted her there. Each lively toast only made the difference more obvious, who belonged and who was just barely being tolerated. With every clink of a glass and formal cheer, the pecking order among the guests was on full display, showing who carried the right name or came from the right old Boston families and who did not. On some level, Eleanor expected this. She remembered what Caroline told her, always keep your head up and don't let anyone see you rattled. There was something strong about the way Eleanor stood, even as she realized the doors of conversation were closed to her. She carried herself with gentle confidence, not needing to force her presence. When people edged her out, she just smiled a little and let her gaze wander, soaking in the hidden details. She watched the Parkers light up around a visiting judge, the way they all leaned closer when the mayor's daughter walked in, and how the servers stuck to silent efficiency whenever passing the big family clusters. Eleanor found herself by one of the windows, fiddling with the stem of her glass. The old linen curtains gently billowed with the draught, half concealing views of the lush green lawns outside. She watched the city lights slowly flicker to life in the dusky evening. In those moments, she saw right through the thin show that the event put on, The perfect smiles, the clothes chosen to impress, the conversations about art and literature that skirted anything real. No matter how shut out she felt, Eleanor noticed the signs of kindness hiding underneath. The younger cousin, Alice, sent her an understanding glance from the other side of the room, and the old housekeeper made sure Eleanor's glass was always filled, slipping her a quiet, "You're doing fine, dear," between trips. Through all of this, Eleanor didn't let the coolness of the Parkers unsettle her. It was clear the approval of this circle meant nothing compared to the warmth that came from genuine moments. She took a steady breath, held onto her calm, and decided to stay because she owed it to Caroline and to herself, not to fade into the background just because of a few cold shoulders. Jonathan, noticing the discomfort etched on his grandmother's face, felt a stubborn knot of anger and embarrassment start to tighten deep inside him. It was hard to watch, the way his own family drew lines and set rules in such quiet, pointed ways, especially now, with everyone gathered and the stakes so high. He wanted to step in, to say what he really thought, to protect Eleanor from the cold shoulders and empty words that floated through the room. Slowly, he rose from his seat near the corner, trying not to attract attention, ready to defend her, even if it meant causing a small scene. But before he could take a single step, Eleanor looked up and caught his eye. Her calm expression didn't waver, and she gave him the gentlest of nods. That one look told Jonathan everything he needed to know. This wasn't his battle to fight. This was Eleanor's moment, and she wanted to face it with her own quiet strength. He paused, uneasy at first, but then a sense of respect flickered inside him for the woman who had always faced life's challenges head-on. The clinking glasses and soft background music seemed to fade for a second, replaced by the heavy silence of understanding passing between them. In that brief exchange, a whole conversation happened without words. Jonathan, the loyal grandson, aching to rush to her side, realized that Eleanor's true resilience lay in her steady presence and the grace with which she handled herself. She reminded him without speaking that not all battles were fought loudly, and sometimes real strength showed up in gentle acts and choosing not to react. The air around them felt different for a moment. Jonathan looked away and took a slow breath, letting himself relax enough to sit back down, forcing his fingers to unclench. He watched as Eleanor continued to mingle, her interactions hardly missing a beat, as if she chose to see the good in others first. He was proud of her, and at the same time a little ashamed of how quickly his own anger had flared up. The lesson was clear. Eleanor's way was not about making a dramatic stand in front of everyone, but about meeting subtle rudeness with dignity and even a bit of humor. The evening pressed on, and their moment was already tucked away, a silent promise between them that, no matter how exclusive the room felt, they understood each other perfectly. As the night moved forward, something in the atmosphere began to change. Despite the layers of careful etiquette and the usual routines of polite society, people started to drift toward Eleanor. At first, it was just a few of the younger guests, college-age cousins and a neighbor from the next block over, drawn, in partly by curiosity, maybe just a little tired of performing for the Parker family. They found themselves lingering near Eleanor, pulled in by her calm, genuine energy. Unlike the other adults in the room, she didn't interrupt or talk over anyone. Instead, she listened, really listened, and somehow that made everyone feel like their words mattered. Soon enough, conversations grew less stiff, less about the weather or the history of Boston's neighborhoods, and more about honest worries and hopes. Eleanor leaned in to hear a shy teenager talk about her first year at Tufts, giving small bits of advice about handling big changes. She chatted with a young man worried about starting a new job in a few weeks, reminding him that everyone feels like an outsider sometimes, even the people who seem to fit in perfectly. Her voice was always soft, but steady enough that people leaned forward to catch every word. When she spoke, there was something in the way she told stories about patience or reminded people that life works out at its own pace that made others actually stop and think. It was surprising how quickly the circle around her grew. Alice, the cousin who had sent her a supportive glance earlier, found herself sitting beside Eleanor, both of them nodding along to an old story about how Eleanor had once gotten lost in downtown Boston, but ended up making a friend who helped her find her way. Others, overhearing, started asking questions and sticking around. Conversations floated from careers to dreams to the small doubts everyone keeps hidden, subjects only talked about when people feel safe enough to let their guard down. What started as sympathy grew into a real sense of connection. For once, guests let go of their need to impress, choosing instead to listen. Eleanor's thoughtful advice about showing patience with challenging relatives or humility and ambition gave people something to hold on to as the night stretched on. In the middle of sparkling lights, elegant clothes, and all the old family rules, a new kind of warmth grew strong, and everyone around Eleanor began to feel When it came time for dinner, the room was filled with the clinking of glasses and the gentle hush that comes after a long cocktail hour. Guests found their seats at round tables draped in white linen, each place setting polished to a shine. At one of the larger tables near the garden doors, Marcus, a well-known chef from the city who had been hired just for this special evening, made his way to his seat. By some quiet bit of luck, or maybe intention, he found himself seated right next to Eleanor. Marcus, in his late 40s and respected for his dedication, sat down with a friendly nod. He had heard about Eleanor through family connections, but never met her in person. There was both a kind of respect and genuine curiosity in the way he settled in. Between courses, the two slipped into easy conversation. Eleanor asked thoughtful questions about his early days in the kitchens and about the hours spent prepping when no one else was around. Marcus found himself talking more openly than he expected, remembering long nights learning to make perfect clam chowder, or his first nervous mornings prepping breakfast at a small diner out in Worcester. When Eleanor spoke about the importance of careful, honest work, no matter who noticed, something seemed to click with Marcus. Her simple, kind praise for working with purpose, even when applause is rare, touched him. His face had a quiet glow, eyes shining with the feeling of being truly understood. For all his awards and public compliments, what Marcus heard from Eleanor meant more because it was personal and real. A little later, the chatter in the room calmed as Marcus took center stage for his planned speech about the evening's menu. He started describing each dish, from fresh Cape Cod oysters to the roasted duck, but then did something unexpected. Turning toward Eleanor, Marcus dedicated the meal to her, not for her name, but for her steadfast approach to life. He spoke about people who put in effort not for applause or titles, but because doing good work matters for its own sake, whether in a kitchen or anywhere else. The room paused in silence. Some Parkers exchanged awkward, forced smiles, clearly not expecting this shift. Jonathan locked eyes with Eleanor, a huge grin lighting up his face. If the Parkers felt a little uncomfortable, it didn't matter. Marcus's words turned the spotlight, just for a moment, to a quieter, perhaps more lasting kind of heroism. Even after the unexpected dedication from Marcus and the small stir it caused, the hosts, Caroline's parents and a few of the older Parkers, slipped back into their old patterns almost as if nothing had happened. They carried on, politely steering conversation and laughter back to their chosen subjects, carefully keeping the spotlight away from Eleanor. It was subtle, the way they managed it, always framing group photos so she was just out of view, or pulling the most influential guests away for private chats near the head table. More than once, someone would look right past Eleanor, their smiles pointedly reserved for those they felt truly mattered. She was left mostly undisturbed in a corner of the grand hall, her chair set noticeably apart, but graced with a lovely view. A window looking out over the soft glow of lanterns strung along the garden path. If anyone noticed how she was edged, away from the center, no one said much about it aloud. It was hard not to see the pattern. For the Parkers, keeping up appearances was everything, and an old story lived on about whose presence supported the family's flawless reputation, and whose did not. Eleanor's calm presence, her simple authenticity, felt out of step with a tradition that measured worth by names and circles, not character. It was as if her very existence gently pushed at the borders of the story the Parkers wanted to tell. About themselves, a story carefully written and handed down for more than 100 years. But sitting a little ways back from the bustle of the party, another guest saw everything with sharp eyes. At one end of the hall, tucked between a marble pillar and a grandfather clock, sat Harold, an older gentleman whose own past crossed with Eleanor's years ago, back when their children were young and Boston still held space for small acts of kindness. Unlike many of the guests, Harold was less interested in displays and more driven by a sense of fairness. He watched, noting the subtle snubs, the way conversations shifted or doors closed whenever Eleanor came near. Harold didn't rush in or draw attention. He understood the art of quiet action. As the chatter and music washed over the room, he reflected on his shared history with Eleanor and made up his mind to act. It would be small and subtle, something that would reinforce for Eleanor, and maybe a few others, that she was not nearly as alone as the Parkers wanted her to feel. Harold took in the scene with a heavy heart. He remembered so many moments from the past when Eleanor had helped others, quietly doing good without seeking anything in return. Over the years, he had come to admire her strength and how she never let bitterness take hold, no matter how many times the world seemed eager to push her aside. Seeing her treated so coldly now by people who should have known better stirred something inside him. He felt a deep sadness at the way gratitude could turn so quickly into indifference, and how easily some slipped into arrogance just because tradition had always given them the upper hand. But Harold was not someone to give in to despair or let an evening's cruelty go unanswered. As the wine glasses clinked together and laughter bounced around the walls, he promised himself he would do more than just observe. He wouldn't let this party end with Eleanor's quiet grace going unnoticed, nor would he allow those who looked down on her to walk away believing they had the last word. He saw an opportunity not for public drama, but for a gentle shift, something real and lasting. While he sat with his cup of coffee, Harold started planning. He remembered stories from years ago, simple acts of kindness Eleanor had offered his family when they faced tight turns, letters of encouragement she had written, even meals she had delivered to his door after his wife became ill. These memories pushed him onward and made his resolve even firmer. This was not just about him or Eleanor. It was about waking the room up to an uncomfortable truth and doing so with tact. Harold realized that sometimes the best way to make people see clearly was to let the truth unfold in a way too honest to ignore. He thought about reaching out to a few of the more open-minded guests, maybe sharing a story here, a memory there, planting seeds in passing conversation. Perhaps he could speak with Marcus the chef, or find a quiet moment to tell Jonathan a tale or two about what Eleanor's kindness had meant to real people. If the Parkers thrived on legacy and image, maybe it was time their story included a dose of honesty, told in such a respectful way no one could twist it. By the end of the night, Harold was set on not letting this injustice pass quietly, determined to start a ripple that would keep growing long after the last song faded out. When the time came to open the dance floor, a few guests straightened their jackets and smoothed their dresses, aware this was more than just music. It was their chance to display all those subtle connections that mattered so much at Parker events. Couples carefully began pairing off, some eager, others just following. The unwritten rules. Laughter mingled with clinks of glasses, but beneath it all, there was a hint of nervousness about how this public part of the evening would play out. The DJ, a young man named Anthony, looked a little out of place among the polished crowd. While many dismissed him as just another hired hand, Anthony carried a history that connected him deeply to one person in the room, Eleanor. Years ago, when he was struggling after his family's bakery in Roxbury burned down, he had been given a lifeline. Eleanor had quietly arranged for him to receive a scholarship from the Rooted Futures Foundation, an organization she started to support local kids facing tough odds. That support had shifted the direction of his life, giving him a shot at music school when he thought all doors were closing. Now, seeing how Eleanor was being set aside in the very room where so many owed her kindness, Anthony felt a responsibility to share a bit of that truth. When the moment arrived for the first dance, and all eyes expected a simple, polite announcement, Anthony's hands trembled a little as he took the microphone. He cleared his throat, fighting to keep his voice steady in front of the curious faces. "Before we kick off tonight's dancing," he said, "I want to dedicate this first song to someone really special to me. I know I'm not supposed to pick favorites, but I just wouldn't be standing here without the Rooted Futures Foundation. That foundation, and the woman behind it, Eleanor. Honestly, she gave me a chance when nobody else would look twice at a kid trying to pay his own way through high school. So this is for her, and anyone who knows what it means to get a chance." The words seemed to hang in the air, changing the night's tempo in a heartbeat. There was an unmistakable pause in the room. The Parkers, who had been working hard to keep their old story front and center, exchanged tight, unsure glances. Around Eleanor, a few people started to nod, their faces softening as the DJ's words sank in. What was planned as a polished show of unity now carried the ring of real gratitude. At first, Caroline, the bride, stayed wrapped up in the whirlwind of her family's celebration. She smiled for the camera, accepted compliments about the flowers and her mother's jewelry, and did her best to keep up the graceful act expected of her as a Parker. But even glancing from the dance floor, it was hard to ignore that the atmosphere had changed. Instead of people crowding around the hosts or clustering at the main table, there was a quiet pull toward Eleanor. Small knots of guests, many of them once hovering near the Parkers for a word or a handshake, had drifted toward the edges of the room, right where Eleanor sat, half in the glow of garden lights. What started as casual conversations grew into deeper, livelier clusters. Some people came just to listen, others to add their own stories, like the scholarship Anthony mentioned, or how Eleanor's guidance had changed the direction of someone's career. What really struck Caroline was how natural it all seemed. No one acted out of obligation or for show. They were simply drawn in by a sense of sincerity, the kind her family usually tried to control but rarely achieved. She caught glimpses of laughter, sometimes a soft touch to the shoulder, the kind of genuine connection that made the night feel more real than any planned highlight. As the evening wore on, that strange sense of curiosity turned into something a little sharper. For the first time, Caroline felt a flicker of frustration, but not for herself or even her parents. She was surprised to feel a little angry on Eleanor's behalf. How had they all missed what really mattered when it was sitting in front of them the whole time? The conversations swirling around Eleanor had nothing to do with titles or money, but everything to do with respect. Caroline realized slowly that while her family had taught her how to hold a glass or greet a senator, it was Eleanor who showed everyone what dignity looked like without needing applause. It was humbling, watching the truest kind of recognition gather out of sight of the stage lights. Caroline's usual pride in carrying the Parker name faded, replaced by a mix of awe and regret. As the crowd around Eleanor grew, old friends, new faces, even a few of the skeptical in-laws, Caroline knew something in her had shifted. The magic in the room didn't shine from the polished silver or sweeping toasts, but from the steady kindness that Eleanor seemed to give away so easily, and that everyone suddenly wanted to hold close. Among the tables covered in carefully arranged linens and vases overflowing with rare orchids, the staff moved quietly, making their way through the crowd with practiced efficiency. Waitresses in dark uniforms offered more drinks, while one or two attendants gathered empty plates, always aiming to do their work without standing out. Still, whenever any of them happened to pass by Eleanor, something always shifted. Just a little. Heads dipped slightly, eyes met hers with gratitude, and small, subtle smiles flickered across their faces. It wasn't loud or showy, but to anyone paying close attention, the respect was unmistakable. These gestures didn't disrupt the flow of the party, but they carried a weight that seemed to linger over every white tablecloth and polished fork. Their regard for Eleanor didn't go unnoticed, especially not by the younger Parkers. For most of their lives, they'd heard their parents tell and retell the family's triumphs, always spotlighting the cleverness and success of the generations that came before. But tonight, as they watched servers, people whose names rarely made it into dinner conversations, treat Eleanor with such quiet dignity, it was hard not to question the old stories. They began to see a new kind of hero among them, not just through speeches or orchestrated applause, but from moments that seemed honest and unplanned. Maybe the tales around the Parker table had skipped a few important details about kindness, humility, and real impact. Some of the young Parkers traded glances, uncertain at first if they were seeing things right. But as the night continued, the evidence kept piling up. When a dishwasher paused mid-stride just to thank Eleanor for helping his cousin, or when a bartender slipped her an appreciative nod with the next refill of sparkling water, it made an impression that no big speech from their parents could match. The realization settled in slowly. Maybe the biggest influence at this wedding belonged not to those who grasped for the most attention, but to someone who walked through the evening, quietly shaping the mood of the whole event. A few of the more thoughtful cousins drifted over, hanging back at first, then joining the gentle ring of conversation around Eleanor. The whisper of change was subtle, but real, and by the time dessert was being served, wordless admiration had done what polished words and family pride could not. It cracked open the old narrative, letting in some much-needed truth about what kind of legacy really mattered. As the plates were cleared away and soft music faded into a deliberate hush, everyone knew the official speeches were about to start. There was a gentle clinking of glasses as guests looked toward the raised stage at the far end of the hall. The event planner, Samantha, took the microphone in hand, her words ringing out with just the right mix of excitement and suspense. She held the room's attention as she announced the arrival of someone the Parkers had talked about all evening. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest of honor, Harold Dalton," she called, her American accent sharp and clear over the Boston crowd. A little buzz went through the tables as people straightened up, eager to catch a glimpse of Harold. For the older Parkers, it was a moment of immense satisfaction. Harold's family name had stood for old-school Boston excellence in law and banking for decades, and his ties to university boards and city charities were the sort they loved to mention over and over. Carolyn's father, James, puffed his chest with pleasure, the corners of his mouth lifting just enough to show he felt the prestige was finally paying off. The anticipation in the air was thick. The family's reputation was about to be displayed for all to see, polished and gleaming, just as they'd hoped when planning every last detail of this wedding. But none of them guessed what Harold had. "You planned." He made his way slowly to the microphone, offering warm nods to faces both familiar and new as he went. He thanked Samantha with a gentle squeeze to her shoulder, then turned and looked out over the tables, taking in not just the high-profile guests near the stage, but also the staff working quietly and the tight circle that had formed around Eleanor by the window. The room stilled, expecting a story about the Parker family's place in Boston, or perhaps a flowery blessing for the bride and groom. Instead, Harold's gaze landed on Eleanor, and a softer sort of pride came to his face. He waited just a second longer before beginning, letting the expectation settle so he could reshape it. "We're here tonight to celebrate love and community," he started, his voice even and strong, "and I want to talk about what that truly means, made real by someone who's shown us the heart behind all these traditions." The room shifted, a new kind of attention darting toward Eleanor, who sat quietly with humble strength that needed no spotlight. Drawing a deep breath, Harold stepped up onto the little stage that had been set by the windows overlooking Beacon Hill. The room was filled with a kind of attention that went beyond basic politeness. He could sense the mix of expectation and entitlement swirling among the well-dressed guests. Some anticipated a string of compliments for the Parker family, perhaps a reference to their well-known roles in the city's history, or clever nods to the countless fundraisers and galas linked to their name. But Harold had always believed that real moments came not from following a script, but from speaking the truth, especially when no one saw it coming. He stood for a moment, letting the quiet settle, then began in a way no one expected. Most of us know how easy it is to celebrate names and titles, the sort of legacy we inherit from plaques on buildings or parent-teacher dinners at the club. But real inspiration, the kind that changes lives, doesn't come with noise. It comes quietly, in small moments, from people who don't ask for recognition. His eyes drifted over to Eleanor, who looked up startled and just a bit embarrassed. "Eleanor Davis," Harold continued, his voice steady, "has inspired more real change in Boston than any committee or donation when families needed help. After the old Dorchester Library closed, she was there, organizing book drives before anyone put out a press release. When kids lost hope after the community center fire, she was the one making late-night calls, moving mountains so they could still get music lessons or space to run. I know, because my own son was one of those kids. He stands on his own today because Eleanor noticed the people others overlooked." His words landed with a weight that kept everyone still. Even the servers paused at the edges of the room, watching as the careful image of tradition gave way to the truth. Harold's speech didn't sound angry or dramatic, just honest, like he was giving something back that should have never been hidden. "A good name is built, not inherited," he finished, "and the most meaningful legacy here tonight quietly lives in Eleanor's example." Around the room, people seemed to share a single breath. The silence stretched, respectful and charged. The spotlight finally found where it belonged, not on reputation, but on the kind of steady goodness that was so often left out of the story. After Harold's words faded into that heavy silence, the mood across the room shifted. It was almost as if the usual flow of conversation and laughter had been paused, air thick enough that everyone sensed something different was settling in. Guests who had arrived, carrying themselves with easy confidence, now fidgeted with napkins or focused a little too hard on the centerpiece flowers. Some kept their eyes down, others managed awkward half-smiles, but there was a shared sense that they'd all heard something that demanded a closer look at their own beliefs and habits. And a few of the long-time family friends, folks who used to pride themselves on being seen at every important Boston gathering, glanced around as if searching for a way to make sense of the moment. They had spent years trading stories about who had done what, who knew the right people, whose kids had gone to Harvard or Yale. But as the true measure of character was spelled out right there in front of them, they recognized an empty feeling that rarely visited such events. Whenever a hush like this took over, It pointed to something real. Meanwhile, the Parkers sat in a strange row of discomfort. James Parker, who had never seemed unsure of himself in his life, looked away from his wife, Mary, who was wringing her hands tightly in her lap. Caroline, the bride, felt the weight of that shift most of all. She saw her parents' faces change, pride, slipping into something nearer to regret, then kindling again as embarrassment. Even the youngest cousins, who never usually noticed matters of reputation or family pride, sensed that perfection was slipping away. For all the planning, for all the careful details, the night would be remembered for what it revealed, not for what had been shown off. Without a word, a handful of people found themselves looking over at Eleanor. There was something quietly reassuring in the way she remained calm, neither hiding nor taking false pride. The night's story had changed, and almost everyone in attendance was forced to face it, that what matters most is rarely flashy or loud. In that stillness, under the glow of 100 tiny lights, the real heart of the gathering stepped forward in the quiet example Eleanor offered, and no one there could pretend not to see it anymore. Mary, Caroline's mother, could not sit still for long after Harold's words. She felt the burn of so many eyes on her, both curious and judgmental, and it rattled her carefully built composure. Without saying much to James or even glancing at her daughter, she stood and walked briskly over to where Eleanor sat near the windows. Mary wore her most practiced smile, one that usually smoothed over trouble at charity dinners or committee meetings. But tonight it seemed brittle, ready to crack with even the slightest pressure. She leaned a little too close and spoke in a voice meant to sound understanding. "Eleanor, I just wanted to say, sometimes these things take people by surprise. Maybe we all got swept up in the celebration, but you know we've always meant well." The words hung in the air, just vague enough to leave an escape route, but clearly an attempt to save face rather than truly admit anything wrong. Some guests nearby caught bits of the conversation, and a ripple of unease ran through the group. Mary's apology felt out of place, almost empty, especially with everyone still caught up in the honesty of Harold's speech. Eleanor looked up and met Mary's gaze, her face steady but gentle. She did not flinch or try to make things easier for Mary. With only a few words, she cut through the awkward effort. "Respect isn't something you ask for," Eleanor said, her voice calm and clear so others could hear as well. "It's something you offer." She did not raise her voice or draw attention to herself, but the simplicity of her response seemed to settle throughout the whole hall. More than any speech or carefully selected toast, those words reached everyone. Mary faltered, the smile faltering as well, and for a moment she looked smaller, almost relieved to retreat back toward her family. Around the room, people began to murmur quietly, some glancing in appreciation at Eleanor, others shifting in their seats, quietly re-evaluating their own actions from earlier in the night. It became clear that no show of pride or last-minute apology from the hosts could undo the hurt or change the lesson everyone just received. Sometimes truth arrives in only a few words, and the lesson, offered without bitterness, leaves a mark that lingers longer than 1,000 polite speeches. Among the guests, one man had been watching the whole evening with careful interest. Richard Foster was known in Boston's finance circles as someone whose word could make or break a business deal. Over the years, his investment firm had quietly put money into several Parker ventures, ranging from commercial real estate to small tech startups that the family had used to expand their influence. But as he listened to Harold's speech and then watched Mary's awkward attempt at damage control, Richard realized he was witnessing more than just uncomfortable family drama. He saw a public spotlight shift onto what really mattered, values, not just profits or prestige. Richard picked up his phone under the table, his face neutral as he sent a quick message to his chief operating officer. The note was short, stating that effective immediately, any pending negotiations with Parker-owned businesses were to be reviewed and, unless there was a remarkable shift in direction, quietly withdrawn. It was not about making a public show of disapproval. It was about aligning his company's image with the type of integrity people had witnessed in Eleanor. Richard believed that if trust was broken so visibly here, it would crack quietly in their boardrooms as well. Within minutes, his team responded, confirming the process had already started. Richard then stood and left without ceremony, his movement catching the attention of a few sharp-eyed attendees. A subtle buzz began to move through the guests as people wondered why such an important figure was leaving abruptly before the final toast. Word spread quickly among the business savvy in the room, and whispers grew louder. He had been seen on his phone, and something had changed. The Parkers, who had always counted on their strong business ties as part of their standing, in Boston now felt a different kind of unease settling in. James poked at his dessert but barely tasted it, eyes darting between his wife and other well-known faces to see who else might be slipping away from their circle. There was a sharp awareness that their grip on influence was less certain than they'd ever realized. In a single evening, things had shifted. It was not power or old alliances holding the room together now. It was respect, a currency they suddenly realized was far more valuable than anything printed on a check or outlined in a legal contract. Michael sat in his seat at the table, trying to keep a calm face as the mood in the hall grew even more uneasy. He had always pictured this wedding as a day filled with happiness, where his love for Caroline would be celebrated by everyone they cared about. But now, that feeling was tangled with all sorts of doubts. As he glanced around, Michael caught the not-so-subtle glances exchanged between some distant cousins and overheard quiet comments that barely hid their disapproval. What stung more than any words was the feeling that so many people seemed eager to judge rather than simply be happy for them. All along, Michael had dreamed of this night as a fresh start. Two families coming together, friends laughing, and nothing standing in the way of their future. Instead, the air held an awkwardness that made every little toast and anecdote feel forced. The fantasy of the perfect wedding suddenly seemed small compared to the reality of these unspoken tensions. For years, Michael had thought the biggest challenge would be the logistics, like picking a menu or finding the right band. But this was something he had never anticipated, the sinking realization that sometimes tradition carries its own sharp edges. Yet, in the middle of it all, he kept looking over at Eleanor. Her quiet strength meant more now than ever. Even after the public snub and the cold attempt at apology, she remained steady, showing grace that no one could ignore. Watching her, Michael began to see things differently. He felt a mix of guilt and admiration, guilt that he had let himself be swept along by what others expected, admiration for the way Eleanor carried herself with calm dignity. Something changed in Michael as the night went on. He started to question what it truly meant to honor someone who had always been his rock. Was it simply following the script, letting others set the terms for what mattered? Or was real respect found in standing up, making sure the people who built you up were actually seen and appreciated? Michael realized he did not just want to smile and nod through a night that left important truths unsaid. Encouraged by Eleanor's presence, he decided he would no longer just watch as a guest. In his own life, it was time to make sure his gratitude for everything Eleanor had given finally showed. Caroline hardly recognized her own thoughts as she watched the night unravel. The words Harold had spoken, and Eleanor's quiet strength in the face of all that had happened, kept swirling in her mind. For as long as she could remember, she had been taught the right way to act at events like this, the right way to walk, the right way to speak, and above all, the importance of holding the Parker name with pride. But none of that advice made sense anymore. The pride she had once taken for granted felt more like a burden than a blessing. All around her, the grand hall seemed less impressive than usual. The tall windows that normally caught the city lights now looked cold and distant, and the laughter at the next table felt out of place. Caroline had grown up believing that appearances were everything, that her role was to carry the family's image forward without ever letting the mask slip. But there was no hiding from the truth now. The disappointment on her parents' faces and the unease in the room made her realize she did not want to spend her life upholding rules that hurt the very people who mattered most. She could feel a heaviness in her chest, knowing that so much of what she thought was strength had really just been fear. Fear of what others might say, fear of breaking tradition, and fear that she was not enough on her own. But as Caroline watched Eleanor sitting with her quiet confidence, it finally clicked that real value has nothing to do with status or recognition. It was in kindness, in standing up for what's right, and in speaking honestly, even when it made people uncomfortable. For the first time, she wanted to let go of the old ways and everything she once thought she owed to her family name. Instead, Caroline started to imagine a future where she could break the cycle, the polite, endless circle of keeping up appearances and ignoring the harm it caused. She wondered what it would be like to connect with people not just because of where they came from, but because of who they were. That wish to change, to learn from those she had barely noticed before, marked the real beginning of something new. And even though admitting it to herself was hard, Caroline knew that this was how real transformation started, by letting go of false pride and reaching for something genuine, even if it meant taking the first step alone. As the night slipped further into darkness, with many guests already filtering quietly out of the grand hall and only a few lingering behind, Eleanor stood up and asked for the attention of those who remained. There was no hint of bitterness or anger in her voice, just the same gentle calmness she had shown all evening. People stopped their side conversations and turned to listen, sensing that something important was about to be shared. Eleanor spoke simply, letting her words speak for themselves. She explained that despite what many might have imagined about her intentions for the future, she had decided to dedicate her fortune and any inheritance she received to causes that reached beyond her own circle. She would establish scholarships and support projects for young people growing up in neglected neighborhoods, including several areas around the same Boston suburbs where the Parker family had built their name. Eleanor did not list names or boast about the size of her contribution. She talked only about the hope that by helping others find their way forward, her legacy might mean something real and lasting. Her announcement fell over the high-ceilinged, a room like a sudden summer thunderstorm, unexpected but impossible to ignore. At first, there was only silence. It was as if everyone in those elegant halls had to pause and measure the weight of what she had just promised. Then, slowly, the mood shifted. People began to grasp that the grandest legacy in the room was not wealth passed quietly between generations or bragged about over dinner tables. It was the decision to reach out, to let generosity touch the lives of people far removed from private clubs and well-manicured lawns. Among the remaining guests, there was a sense that something had broken loose, a veil lifting off the old habits that had kept pride and separation in place for so long. Some looked at Eleanor with a new kind of respect, while others quietly reconsidered their own priorities and what they hoped to leave behind one day. The talk of social status and reputation, which had been the constant undercurrent all night, faded into the background. In those final moments, it became clear that the truest measure of a legacy was not in what one held onto, but in what one gave away, and Eleanor's calm example gave everyone a different story to take home, one rooted in real hope, not just appearances. Inspired by Eleanor's words and the ripple of hope they sent through the air, Michael and Caroline exchanged a quick, understanding look. Something in that glance told them that after all the tension and expectation, they finally saw what their wedding could mean beyond just a merge of families. Michael reached for Caroline's hand, and with a confidence that surprised even himself, stood up next to her. Quiet fell over the smaller group still gathered in the corner of the old Boston Hall as the couple moved closer to the front. Most guests expected only a few awkward words, maybe another thank you, but instead Michael cleared his throat and spoke up. "We want to start something new," Michael began, looking first at Eleanor, then out at their friends and family. "Tonight has taught us that tradition should lift people up, not lock them out. So together, we're going to start an institute focused on social inclusion. Our hope is that this will become a place where young people from every background can find opportunities, no matter where they come from or who their family is." Caroline, her voice equal parts nervous and sincere, added, "This is not just about us or our families. It's about building something that brings people together and gives back. We want our marriage to stand for more than appearances or old rules. We want to help rewrite what it means to celebrate." There was a soft current of surprise at first, but as the message sank in, the crowd responded with a warmth that had been missing for most of the night. People who had started the evening wrapped up in their own pride or caught up in rivalry now found themselves applauding with real feeling. Young cousins cheered quietly, a few older relatives nodded with approval, and even some of the most rigid guests allowed themselves small smiles. The announcement turned the mood around in a way that felt natural rather than forced. For the first time, dignity returned to the celebration, and the heavy air seemed to lift just a little. The grandeur of the hall and the old talk of social standing faded into the background, replaced by something more hopeful. Michael and Caroline's promise gave the night a sense of honest new beginning, making it clear that change was possible right there, if only people chose to set old habits aside. The celebration now held the possibility of future stories shaped by compassion, rather than by the quiet pressure to fit in. As the last of the guests made their way out of the grand hall, the atmosphere felt very different from when the night had begun. Many walked quickly with downcast eyes, accepting the quiet truth that the old ways, so rigid and proud, had finally given in. Outside, the sunset painted the Boston public garden in shades of gold and deep red, the colors washing over the flowers and hedges like a gentle cleansing. It was as if the earth itself wanted to mark the change that had taken place, letting everyone know that this evening was not just another gathering, but a turning point. Inside, the soft clinking of glasses echoed a little hollow, the sparkle and laughter of earlier hours replaced by a thoughtful silence. Even the scent of the floral centerpieces felt heavier, tinged not only with fragrance, but with memory. It was a reminder that moments like this one, where pride was shaken and real connections surfaced, did not come often and would not be forgotten. Eleanor, standing near the doors as people left, did not try to claim any victory or look for acknowledgement. She did not need it. The way she had held her ground throughout the night, never raising her voice or seeking sympathy, had made a much wider impression than any speech or display ever could. Her dignity spoke on its own, quiet and steady. The Parker family, meanwhile, lingered longer than most, absorbing the weight of everything that had happened. For generations they had trusted in their reputation, their name, and the resources they passed from one hand to the next. But the events of the night had stripped all that away, leaving it clear for everyone, including the Parkers themselves, to see that none of those things could stand in for real character. There was a sense of reckoning, a moment when the meaning of legacy and family came down to more than public image. For Michael and Caroline, the closure of the evening felt less like an ending and more like a beginning. By bringing people together in a new spirit, they had started to set down roots for a different kind of family tradition, one based on humility, kindness, and a willingness to change. As the sun slipped below the trees, it seemed to carry everyone's hopes out into the world, leaving the promise of a better story still to come, planted right where the old world had finally let go.